Based on the work undertaken by Claire Graves. In the 1950s, Claire Graves worked with Maurice Massey. Graves' work has been taken forward by Don Beck and Dr. Chris Cowan. Okay, spiral dynamics build on the research undertaken in the 50s and 60s by US psychologist Dr. Claire W. Graves of Union College, New York. Graves was searching to understand human nature and asking deep questions like we ask on this course. He wanted to understand the human nature. Why are some people different? Okay. He wanted to know why some people change but others don't change. He wanted to know why the mind responds, how the mind responds to a world that becomes increasingly more and more complex. Okay, so there's a curiosity there. So Graves started to look for patterns in human development, and they related to other theories and spent over 20 years gathering primary data from thousands of sources. Okay, he originally was seeking to validate his contemporary and friend Maslow. You've obviously come across Maslow before, hierarchy of human needs. Okay, so Maslow was a genius, and his contemporary was Maslow, and he was looking to validate his work. What does Maslow think? Well, we can actualize. We can actualize under the right conditions. So, but equally in saying that, even after we've actualized, we can also, in any stage model, go back to base again, depending on circumstances. So, for example, if you have actualized, you've got food, water, shelter, security, job, finances, family, social network, and all of a sudden the rug swept under you, then there's a good chance you're going to go to the bottom of the barrel again. Graves passed away in 1986 before he could finish and publish his research. Okay. Graves' work, also known as Gravesian theory, was taken and developed by two of his students, Christopher Cowan and Don Beck, who coined the term. They coined the term, according to the research, spiral dynamic. Okay. Don Beck was involved and used spiral dynamics model in the South African transition from apartheid to multicultural democracy during the early mid-90s. Okay, so there's some couple of research papers there, Beck and Cowan 96, and Hansen, 3 pages. You can see, and that talks more about the transition. What problems would you envisage? Now, obviously they weren't the only ones, but that helped with the transition, but the research suggested they were involved in the transition. What are some of the problems that would have, that transition, it could have gone disastrously? Obviously, the apartheid, and you can imagine the challenges that South Africa faced at the time. So Don Beck was one of many people who worked with stakeholders in South Africa to ensure the transition from apartheid was as smooth as possible. And there's a good book, actually, The Crucible, Forging South Africa's Future. It's quite a useful book, and the authors Don Beck, Graham Linscott. It might have been republished, I don't know. I read that book many, many years ago, and it was quite useful. It was quite a fascinating read, a really, really fascinating read in terms of their involvement, according to them, in the transition of South Africa. Don Beck used the strategy. You recall South Africa had the World Cup in South Africa, Rugby World Cup anyway. Don Beck, from what I understand, is a big sports fan, and he used the World Cup in a way to reunite, or to unite through sport. Sport can have a really big effect on people, huge effect on people, and that was one vehicle to unite the country. And in a way, in some instances, when you think about some of the interviews in the World Cup last year, South Africa won, some of the interviews, it sort of meant a lot to people. It was a way of people to unite and come together. So the spiral model has 8 levels of reality, 2 tiers. Each level relates to a cultural reality, a psychological reality, a cognitive reality for human beings. Okay, it's a useful model, I believe, for leadership, conflict management, organisational change, communication and marketing, working with diverse communities, cultural transformation. So it's really useful in those areas. And also, if you want, I can sort of email you the slides as well. You can have them, so you can have the slides and do what you want with the slides. Yeah. In the first tier of spiral dynamic, there are 6 levels of development, beginning with beige, which generally relates to what occurred 100,000 years ago. And this is the most survival-orientated paradigm. The worldview, these are people who are living pretty much hand to mouth. The second tier is an exceptionally large jump upward on the scale of human development stages. Only a small percentage of the population, according to this model, make the jump to the second tier. Okay? And we'll look at the means shortly. So the second tier, means, level of existence, are coded as yellow and turquoise. It's said that less than 5% of the global population currently exists primarily in the second tier. Okay, so you can sort of see here the sort of levels of tiers. We'll go into more detail as we go on, sort of 1 to 6 levels of consciousness. And they're in the manual, they're in the book, sorry, the pages I've printed off for you there as well. And that'll sort of give you a better indication, but we'll look at that and we'll go through that each stage shortly. Human intelligence is one that arises in response to life conditions. One could make the point. So there's 8 levels of reality. 2 tiers, each relates to cultural reality, psychological reality, and cognitive reality we've mentioned there. And we'll sort of go through this as we go as well. So according to Graves, we can go up to 30 or 40 levels. Okay, but as it happens, spiral dynamics is arranged in hierarchy from 1 to 8. There are more levels after 8. We're just not there yet as a species. Okay. It starts from the bottom and goes up. Spiral dynamics, each state has a colour, and you'll see there's a colour for each state, and we will go through each colour. You'll see beige, purple, red, blue, orange, green, yellow, turquoise, and here it gives you a little bit more detail of what its manifestations and personal displays are, but we'll go into in more detail as I write it for you there as well. Okay, spiral dynamic, it's a bio-psychosocial spiritual system way of thinking. So bio, psycho, social spiritual system in the ways of thinking. Each of the stages was an attempt for people to be right and to create a human value system. They needed to be right, they needed to be either accepted by others or by rejecting others, accepting themselves. Old ways of coping don't disappear. We just progress onto higher levels. Each level builds on previous levels. And we can't go directly to one we'd like to be without first going through a previous one. Okay, so what we're saying there is you're not going to go from beige to yellow, if that sort of makes sense, without going through the gears. Okay? Each of these stages we mentioned is an attempt for people to be right, create a value system. They need to be right. They need to be either accepted or by rejecting others to accept themselves. The first level is beige. Okay, beige is what occurred at the beginning, 100,000 years ago, and this is the most survival-orientated paradigm. So the beige level, the first level, you'll see level 1, survival instinctive. Food, water, procreation, warmth, protection, staying alive. Okay? First level, beige. The worldview, people are living pretty much hand to mouth. Okay? In some countries, in some environments, people are living hand to mouth. Very rare in the world we live in these days, but it is that way. People that way, from that respect, it's sort of hand to mouth. From a point of view, from an individualized point of view, it's from birth to 4 years old. And people who are homeless in our society, In our society, people who are homeless, who live in sort of hand to mouth, probably relate to beige. And when you're born to 4 years of age, okay, so roughly about 4, you're sort of surviving. You're watered, you're fed, you're nurtured, yeah? The purple meme is the second level of the spiral. The focus now is the tribe. Instead of just the individual, supposedly here we can think back 50,000 years ago. Okay, so 50,000 years ago, we can focus now, the tribe begins, the purple meme. On a micro level, this is where the toddler starts to see themselves as part of a family or a group. So 0 to 4, or maybe let's say 3 or 4 years of age, you start to see yourself as part of the group, okay, on a micro level. On a macro level, on a wider level, it begins about 50,000 years ago. That's when the tribe starts to form. Now, 50,000 years ago in the tribe, ritualistic thinking, okay, moon means this, okay, this means that. We have that sort of ritualistic staying in the tribe. So the 3-year-old realizes that the best way to survive is what? Bonding to the family. Okay. As a human species, we're quite vulnerable in our early years predominantly. What happens if can we survive on our own? We got to bond. Okay, so we need to bond. We need to be in the tribe. Okay, and the tribe being the family unit, our caregivers. So the purple meme is a second level of spiral. The groups become more organized into well-constituted clans. Okay. The purple second level, the beginning of cultural development. There were people in the beginning to make kinds of connections that we make. We could call that superstition now, if you will. But in fact, they're making connections in their own mind between events. Okay? So sort of connections people make between events. So just speaking of that, we've just seen a magpie there. Some people might salute the magpie. So we sort of make connections, and that means I'll get back, good luck, whatever. So, okay, so purple, if I do this, that will happen. A biopsychosocial development. They associate the full moon to, if there's a horse underneath the full moon, that means it's going to happen. And, sacrifice for safety. Okay. The red level begins about 10,000 years ago. The purple level would break into a red level, an individualistic level. I want to be my own person. No part or rites of passage. Warlord level. Okay? The red level, the strongest survive. When 1 or 2 people stand out from the rest of the tribe, the tribal leaders, okay, the tribal leaders. Has anyone ever seen the film the Planet of the Apes? So you got the tribal leaders, okay, the red level, okay. I am my own person. I can do this on my own, okay. On a micro level, the teenager becomes rebellious, okay. The rebellious years. So you give the teenager some advice based on experience. I don't need your advice. You don't need to tell me. I don't think you should walk down that street. Oh, you don't tell me what to do. Does that make sense? On a micro level. So they learn to stand up for themselves. Okay. They learn to stand up for themselves. But what happens when you stand up for yourself? What happens eventually? Can you fight everybody?
No.
Eventually there's going to be someone that is not a pushover. Okay? And that realization, not everyone's a pushover. Okay? Someone comes along and is bigger and uglier and stronger, and that's the end of that. So the problems that red created would bring about the fourth system, which is designated blue. And that corresponds to about 5,000 years ago. And that was a time when we had organized religion. It becomes organized. The beginning of Christianity and Judaism during this period of time. Law and rule are created. Law and order and rule. On a micro level, this is when we learn to identify with an institution or paradigm bigger than us. Okay? Less me, more we. Civilizations create armies and better ways to enforce law. Okay, so we have law enforcement, we have armies, we have police, we enforce the law, we've got these rules that we adhere to. So for example, on a micro level, the person might work for the public service and get, a job for life, and after 40 years get the gold watch. Does that sort of make sense? Are they is comfortable just conforming? High conforming character. Don't push the boat. Do what you're told. Don't toe the line. Okay. The fourth system, which is designated blue, is an antidote to mayhem of red. I mean, the reality is, could we sort of, as a society, if everyone was operating at red, what do you think would happen? It'd be mayhem, wouldn't it? Everyone trying to outdo each other and the strongest, and so we have some order. It's an antidote to that. And blue, the blue to enlightened system, when plagues swept Europe and wiped out millions of people, there was a tremendous crisis of faith. People did not feel protected. Okay, they felt that faith did not protect them from the adversity of the catastrophes like the plagues. A system had changed to orange. A system, a worldview that is characterized by scientific method. Okay, think of some of the prominent people. Theoretically, we started looking at science. Okay. The Enlightenment period, which is orange, the fifth system, is the birth of capitalism. Okay, so we've got the birth of, if you want to call it capitalism. It's another story for another day. But science and technology become very important at level 5. Okay, science-based. Okay, the me-centric, the focus on the individual. Okay. When you think of orange, when you think of orange and over here, gratification, blitz, conquest, when you think of orange, we start to think materialistic, consumerism, success, image, status, growth. Not just any old watch, a certain type of watch. Not just any type of phone, a certain type of phone. Consumerism, materialism, social status. Okay, does that sort of make sense? We start to think we can obtain, we can sort of have the finer things in life, so to speak. So the orange level, as you can see, and we'll sort of move forward, moves up to green. It's an ecological level. It goes back to we again. We achieve goals. It's not just about business, money, fame, community. How can we give back to the world? What else is there at the green level? Think of green level. Think of sort of some of the systems we've got in place at green level. So we've got, for example, sharing and caring and community. Okay? You can think of egalitarian, human bond, consensus thinking. Yellow, green goes to yellow, and when we think, the flow flex level that Don Beck calls it, the flex flow level, I should say. So we think yellow, and we think we move into a different dynamic. So the practicality of green, how practical is green when you think about it? So if you think green, we think, is it really practical? Some of the idealistic ways of thinking, okay, is it really practical? Can we really, the practicality of some of the ideologies to implement them? There's no simple solutions for complex problems. Realization, as much as we, the Greenpeace and all that sort of stuff, great principles, but equally, how can we make that transition? To save the whales, to save the environment. There's no simple solutions to complex problems, and we start to think yellow flow flex, natural systems of self-principle, multiple realities. It becomes more ecological, to the point that we move to turquoise, and that becomes more holistic, collective individualism, cosmic spirituality. Well, the reality is we do need to change, but how do we change? How can we move things forward practically and find solutions to these complex problems that exist? Okay? Each of these stages is an attempt, by the way, for people to be right and create, we mentioned earlier, a value system. They need to be right, to either be accepted by others, or rejecting others and being accepted themselves. Now this goes back, so far back in your family tree, before primate, every organism that lived, procreated and died. To the point where you are now, every organism, primate, dates back the family tree, assessing what was going on, adapting to the environment, avoiding pain, seeking pleasure. We talked about the evolution of the brain yesterday, a nervous system. We think of the simple organism all those years ago. A bit like, you clap your hands and the ponds in the fish, the fish go one way, the other way, and we sort of evolve, layer upon layer brain. So in the beginning, it's about avoiding pain, seeking pleasure. Old ways of coping don't disappear. Okay, we just progress to higher levels according to the model. Each level builds on previous levels, and we can't directly go from one to one we'd like to be without experiencing the ones in between. Okay, conceptually there are limitless levels. Okay, as a species we've only really gotten to 7 as it stands. Is this starting to explain a few things? Okay, so level 8 turquoise is global community life, survival of a fragile earth, consciousness. Okay, so the reality that, okay, there are issues that exist in the world, how are we best solve them? How do we carry on as a species? Okay, where do we go? Now, generally speaking, some of our evolutionary history suggests that tragedies have been paramount in our development as a species. So an adverse event happens, and it brings about realizations. The average level for human species is 4, on average, if you sort of calculate things across a broad range of areas. Now each individual is different, but 4 is about the average. You go back to 4, and you think, the 4th tier, that's about the average. But I suppose some countries are going to have more people at one level, one the other. So you probably go to the States, and predominantly there'll be more people at 5 than, say, for example, maybe sub-Saharan Africa, where if there's war or famine somewhere in the world, does that sort of make sense? I'm not saying one level is better than the other. It's just circumstances prevail. So to give you more context, the USA, it seems that 4 and 5 levels make about roughly 70 to 80% of the population. Okay, level 6 comes in at the USA at about 10% and growing fast. Okay, everyone else is either level 3 or lower. Level 3 is usually teenagers, and if they're older than teenagers, they're often gang members at level 3. Think about the way a gang operates. Okay. There are some adults at level 2 in America, you would say, but mostly children. Okay, mostly children. And the number of level 1s, this is generally represented by infants and maybe the serially homeless. Okay. So in spiral dynamic, the numbers have been replaced with colours, and for the reason to remove prejudice that one is higher or lower, better or worse. So you're not a better or worse if you're at 7 and someone who's at 1. It's just circumstances. If we sort of took you and put you in an environment, if at birth you weren't born in obviously we've got people in different countries here, but if you weren't born in the country you were born, this multicultural group, United Nations group, then would you be a different person? Well, there's a very good chance you would be, in more ways than one, in the way you perceive the world. Okay? So many things influence your level, as well as our genes, and they're not conscious choices completely. So if you're born in a world where it is mayhem and war and famine, it's going to influence your behavior. Agree? Yeah. In certain countries, for example, 2 or 3, beige, red, and spiral, so less developed countries, they're running more at 2 or 3. So countries that experience significant amounts of ongoing war and famine and disaster, then generally speaking, they're going to run at 2 or 3. So they're the more or less developed nations that don't have an infrastructure in the way we have, a healthcare system, the systems that we have in place, welfare systems, policing systems, commercial systems in place. Developed countries are more at 4 and 5. Blue and orange, so America, we talked about, so it's maybe 70% around there. I would say, in my opinion, this is my opinion, I stand corrected, people might agree, disagree, a country like America probably has more people at 5 than people in Europe, probably more at 4 on a spectrum. And I make that assumption based on the fact that it is a more material nation. I make that assumption, that hypothesis based on, if you look at the top 100 companies, they tend to be American, and the sort of drive where they don't have the same welfare system and healthcare system that certain countries in Europe have. It's just more of a social system. But things are changing fast, obviously, but you could make the point that more people in Europe operate at 4 than Americans do based on that. But I stand corrected, each has their own opinion. So it's not individual intelligence, it's cultural development. Okay, we stress that. So it's not to say someone at 4 or 5 is more superior to 2 or 3. The 4 or 5 has created more opportunities. And we see that, if someone moves to this country and has the same opportunities that they didn't have at the country they were before, there's a good chance they could go on to do well. Okay? So if someone decides someone lives in a war-torn country and they decide to move to Sweden, they decide to move to the UK, they decide to move to Spain, and present the same opportunities they've got in those countries, then there's a good chance they can fulfill that. Does that make sense? Just to reiterate, from life perspective, so we think level 1, the child is born, the first priority, survival. Okay? Level 2 is the tribe. You bond to the people who are going to give you the best chance of surviving. Then at level 3, you rebel against the tribe. Okay, you think, well, actually, I know better. Micro level, I mentioned, a teenager decides that, okay, it's sort of outgrown the rules of the family in one sense. 4, more life to anarchy, value systems, rules, order. 5, understand rules, want more, entrepreneurial, science. 6, giving back, Greenpeace, okay. 7, give and give back, the practicality of sort of 6. The practicality, some people who've got some great ideas, idealistically, many people have got great ideas, not to get contentions, and whatever, whatever one believes about climate change is not addressing that issue, it's a complex phenomenon. There's no simple issues, but equally we're seeing people lecturing other people who are causing more problems. So they're having 10 flights a year and they've got all the modern conveniences and they've got air conditioning in the summer and heating in the winter, and they're praising everybody else. Well, I'm sort of looking, thinking, well, actually, I appreciate obviously this is a more complex issue, but we can see the practicality. So we need to think solutions. Okay, so we start to go to 7. Well, what can we do? And 8, we start to realise, well, there's a knock-on effect, there's a butterfly effect. One thing happens at one part of the world that affects somebody somewhere else. You start to realise collectively. Sorry.
I'm just so sorry.
No, you rest. It's okay.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. So when you're in a spiral axis, you can't relate to a level that we can't understand. So people are going to struggle to relate. To show you a clash of memes, by the way, in some parts of the world, in a period of history, the father might eat first, say at beige. If the father dies, then the family could die, prior to the children. So each meme has its own frequency, like an antenna. Okay, it's like its own sort of frequency. So just to sort of have a think for a moment before we do an exercise, have a moment of think. Okay, you don't have to say where you think you are, but where do you think you are on this sort of hierarchy? Okay, where do you think you are at this moment in time? So one way to look at things, okay, wherever you are, is, we mentioned earlier where the model is quite useful. For me, it's quite useful in recognising where someone else is and sort of meeting them where they are to a point, but also understanding a number of other things as well. But take a moment to think, where you think you are, your society is, where you think the world you live in is. Take a moment to think, where it is introspectively can be quite useful. So we're sort of going to do a few exercises shortly. In a moment, we'll do a few exercises, and I will email you the slide, if you will, and people watching in Cyberland, I can email them that as well, and we can sort of go from there. But let's take a moment, just have a moment of deep introspection for a couple of minutes before we do some exercise, and think where you are, where members of your family are, society is, community. Just sort of take a moment of introspection. Some of the people that you interact with, at certain points in your life and ongoing, where you think you are as well. So have a moment of introspection, and we'll sort of go from there.